One might think, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to safeguard against complacency, to speak truth to power? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with so much trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as difficult as these questions may be, many people have answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys His laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Or, our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe in, but have a lot more trouble identifying what they do believe in. In Enlightenment Now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the Enlightenment. In a nutshell, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they have faded into the background as a kind of bland default or status quo or establishment. The other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment. What do I mean by Enlightenment ideals? Well, I single out four: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the hermeneutic parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you explain why you're right, why other people should believe you, as soon as you insist that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. As a species, we are liable to generalize from anecdotes, to reason from stereotypes. We seek evidence that confirms our beliefs, and we disregard evidence that disconfirms them. And we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads me to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, and that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment theme was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. The third Enlightenment ideal, I suggest, is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient beings. Well, enhance human flourishing. You might think, who could be opposed to that? Well, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical force or dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. Now, by default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our blood relatives, our close friends and allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people, education, journalism, art, mobility, and even pure reason. As soon as I engage in a discussion with you, I can't insist that only my interests count because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Finally, we get to progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, if you ask most intellectuals, the answer you get is not very well, because I have found that most intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means that you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to the Voltaire character who declared, "All is for the best in the best of all possible worlds." Well, as it happens, Professor Pangloss was a pessimist. A true optimist would say there can be much better worlds than the one that we have today. But all of that is irrelevant, because the question of whether progress has taken place is not a matter of looking on the bright side, or wearing rose-colored glasses, or seeing the world as the glass is half full. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit that is progress. Well, let's look at the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. But then, with the development of vaccination, then sanitation, antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy at birth today is 71 years. And as Anna reminded you, virtually no one guesses that it is that high. In the developed world, it is more than 80 years. And even though Europe and the Americas were the first regions to escape from early death, the rest of the world is catching up, including Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. For most of history, the biggest contributor to low lifespan was child mortality. In Sweden in 1750, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden brought its rate of child mortality down by a factor of 100, and the rest of the world has been following suit, including Canada in North America, South Korea in Asia, Chile in Latin America, and Ethiopia in sub-Saharan Africa. Still too high at 6%, but the rate continues to fall. Health. For most of human history, the biggest killer was infectious disease. In the developed world, that is no longer a major source of death, but infectious disease still kills people, especially children in the developing world. Nonetheless, just in the last 15 years, the 5 biggest killers of children in the developing world have all been in decline: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories to feed an adult male. And for the first time in human history, England was able to grow that many calories, beginning with the agricultural revolution in the 18th century, the development of advances in agronomy, such as crop rotation, later the invention of synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of agriculture, selective breeding of vigorous hybrids in the Green Revolution. First, the developed world developed the ability to feed its population. More recently, countries in Asia, such as China and India, have been feeding themselves, and here you see the growth of food production in the world as a whole. Now, you might say the ability to grow all of those extra calories would be a dubious form of progress if they simply went to making fat people fatter. But in fact, they have been reducing the rate of undernourishment in the world from 35% in 1970 to less than 15% today. First in Latin America, then in Asia, and now the process is taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, the most severe examples of insufficient calories take place during famines. Famine was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and throughout human history could bring devastation to any part of the world. But famine deaths have been in dramatic decline, and today famines take place only in the most remote and war-torn regions. Prosperity, for most of human history, economic growth was very close to non-existent. You can see that in a graph showing the gross world product from the year 1 to the present, which shows that for 1,500 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. Then, with the Industrial Revolution, the ability to capture energy, the growth of education, of markets, of institutions of finance, and of global trade, prosperity has increased by a factor of about 200 since 1700. The growth of prosperity was highly uneven. The UK and US and other countries in the West were the first to escape from universal poverty and squalor, but more recently, East Asian countries like South Korea have caught up, and Latin America, and now China and India are showing exponential growth. Once again, you could say that this would be a dubious form of progress if all of these gains were simply going to the 1%. But as Anna mentioned, they have been applied to reduce the rate of extreme poverty. If you define extreme poverty as the bare minimum necessary to feed yourself and your family, operationalized as $1.90 per person per day, by that criterion, 200 years ago, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. Today, it is less than 10%. As Anna mentioned, there's been a 2/3 reduction in the last 20 years, a 3/4 reduction in the past 30 years. Some economists call this the greatest achievement in all of human history, and virtually no one knows about it, except the chimpanzees, because they guess at random. As a result, international inequality, the gap between the rich and poor, after necessarily increasing with the Industrial Revolution, as some countries escaped from universal poverty, leaving the rest behind, has now turned a corner because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. Now, of course, within developed countries, inequality is increasing rather than decreasing, but that doesn't mean that developed countries have been indifferent to the plight of the needy. Prior to the 20th century, developed countries devoted about 1.5% of their wealth to redistribution to children, to the elderly, to the sick, to the poor. In the 20th century, every developed country went on a binge of social spending, so that now a median of 22% of GDP in OECD countries is redistributed to the needy. As a result, even as inequality has increased, poverty has decreased in developed countries. In 1960, poverty as measured by disposable income, that is after government benefits, was 33% of the population. Today it is 7%. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, in terms of people's ability to afford food and clothing and shelter, it's declined from 30% to 3%. Peace. For most of history, the great powers of the day were pretty much always at war. War was the natural state of international relations. Peace was a mere brief interlude between wars. You can see that in a graph that shows the percentage of years in each quarter century that the great powers of the day were at war with each other. What we see is that 400 to 500 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Today, they are never at war. The last great power war pitted the United States against China more than 65 years ago. Now, if we focus on the 20th century, we see that even though wars were getting less frequent and shorter, they were also getting more destructive, culminating in World War I and World War II in the 20th century, which were unprecedentedly destructive. But contrary to predictions that it would only be a matter of time before we would see World War III pitting the United States against the Soviet Union, which, because of nuclear weapons, would be even more destructive than World War I and World War II. World War III never happened. The Soviet Union went out of existence mostly peacefully, and the Cold War ended. If we look at the era since the end of the Second World War, we see that there has been an uneven but dramatic decline in the rate of death from all wars combined. This is a gift of democracy, because democracies are less likely to fight each other, of global trade, because countries that engage in a lot of commerce are less likely to go to war. You don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors, and if it's cheaper to buy things than to steal them, then you're less tempted to plunder other countries to get rich. And the rise of international norms and organizations which have made conquest literally illegal and not an acceptable way for countries to settle disputes. Freedom and rights. We have all read about the erosion of democracy in countries like Hungary and Russia and Venezuela and Turkey. Nonetheless, if you count across the world the number of democracies and number of autocracies, you see that democracy has never been more pervasive than it has been in this decade. Unless this seems impossible to believe, remember that just a few decades ago, say when I was in college, half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and ruled by totalitarian Marxist dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of a military junta, as was most of Latin America, and East Asian countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, and Indonesia, all of them democratic today. Child labor. For most of human history, children were sent to work in farms and factories. About 30% of children in the West in 1850. England and the United States, and later other European countries like Italy, reduced the rate of child labor because of a increased affluence, which meant that parents no longer depended on the labor of children to support themselves. Because of the greater importance of education, children were more valuable in schools than in the fields and factories, and a general valuation of the lives of children. This is a process that is now taking place in the world as a whole. In 2015, the Nobel Peace Prize went to Kailash Satyarthi for his efforts to reduce the rates of child labor, which you can see from this graph have been meeting with success. Violent crime. In any part of the world that exists in a state of anarchy, you have violent predation and revenge and cycles of feuding. In medieval Europe, for example, the homicide rate was 35 per 100,000 per year. Then with the expansion of kingdoms over the feudal patchwork of fiefs, violent crime was brought down in England, Netherlands, Italy, also Scandinavia, so that the current homicide rate has gone from 35 per 100,000 per year to 1 per 100,000 per year. This process is replicated whenever governments bring frontier regions under control, and the code of vendetta and revenge and blood feuds is replaced by the rule of law. It happened again in colonial New England, happened in the American Wild West, and it happened in Mexico. Indeed, our lives have become safer in just about every way. because of advances in the technology of automobile safety, like seat belts and airbags, safer highways, and better traffic law enforcement, you are 96% less likely to die in a car crash, 88% less likely to be cut down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to your death, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die in a fire, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated by poison gas. There is one exception in the United States, and that is death by poison, solid or liquid, and here you see the American opioid epidemic. Nonetheless, at the same time, we are 95% less likely to be killed on the job. We're even less likely to die in a so-called act of God, a drought, flood, wildfire, volcano, landslide, earthquake, meteor strike, presumably not because God is any less angry at us, but because of advances in the resilience of our infrastructure and in emergency response systems. And what about the ultimate act of God, the projectile hurled by Zeus, the literal bolt from the blue? Yes, we are 97% less likely to die from a bolt of lightning. Knowledge, the natural state of humanity, is ignorance and illiteracy. Even in early modern Europe, reading and writing was a privilege of a small elite, about 15%. But in the 20th century, every European country achieved universal literacy, as did the United States, a process that is now being replicated in the rest of the world, such as Chile, Mexico, and the world as a whole. Today, 83% of the world can read and write, 90% of the world under the age of 30. And in perhaps the most incredible, unbelievable, astonishing, difficult to accept example of progress of all, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-documented phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores have been increasing by 3 points a decade all over the world for a century, because of the expansion of education and public health and the proliferation of technical concepts and visual symbols from academia and technology and science into everyday life. Well, have any of these advances improved our lives? And the answer is, in many ways, they have. The typical work week in 1870 in the United States and Europe was more than 60 hours. Today, it is fewer than 40. Thanks to the penetration of running water, electricity, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, and microwave ovens, the amount of our time that we lose to housework, the least favorite way of spending our time, has declined from 60 hours a week to fewer than 15 hours a week. And if any of you are unfamiliar with the amazing video by Hans Rosling on the washing machine, I suggest when you go home, Google Rosling washing machine. You're in for a treat. Because of the shorter work week and the amount of our lives that we have reclaimed thanks to labor-saving devices, the amount of leisure time has increased in the last 50 years, both for men and for women. Now, you will notice that the amount of leisure for women has leveled off, the reason being that women spend more time with their children today. In fact, a single working mother today spends more hours with her children than a married stay-at-home mother did in the 1950s. Well, these are things that economists like to measure, and you might say, do they make us any happier? And the answer is, they almost certainly do. There is a very strong relationship between life satisfaction and log of income. Each dot is a country. Each arrow represents the people within a country. The scale is logarithmic, which means that an extra dollar adds much more to the happiness of a poor person than to a rich person, but nonetheless it holds throughout the scale. The graph shows that people in richer countries are happier. Within every country, the richer people are happier. The expectation then is that as the world gets richer, its people get happier. And indeed, that is largely true. In 86% of countries for which we have data over time, happiness has increased over the past few decades. Sweden, the purple line at the top is already so happy that it didn't have much room to improve. But in a majority of countries, the people have gotten happier. So I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of seeing the glass as half full. It is a fact about human history, perhaps the most important fact about human history. So how is the fact of human progress reflected in the news? According to a study of using sentiment mapping, that is tallying the proportion of positive to negative words in news stories, during the past 70 years in which our lives have become safer, longer, healthier, richer, and happier, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose, and a sample of the world's broadcasts has gotten glummer and glummer and glummer. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer comes from cognitive psychology. According to Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, the human brain estimates risk and probability using a mental shortcut they called the availability heuristic. Namely, the higher an event is in the results of the mental search engine, the more quickly an event occurs to us, the more frequent we judge it to be. We use our own memory as a shortcut to estimating probability. Now, consider the nature of news. News is about things that happen, not things that don't happen. And Anna mentioned this in her talk. You never see a journalist saying, I'm reporting live from a country that is at peace, or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. Also, news is about sudden events, not gradual changes. As the economist Max Roser pointed out, the papers could have carried the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran the headline with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. There's also, on top of just the nature of journalism, there is a bias toward the negative in the culture of journalism. This has been shown in studies that ask editors to choose between headlines, and they choose the negative one. And it has been satirized in the American humor magazine, The Onion, with the pseudo-headline, CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Well, if you combine the nature of news with the nature of cognition, you can see why the world is coming to an end, and always has been. There's also a negativity bias, and again, Anna mentioned this, that in our emotional life, bad is stronger than good. We think about and feel bad events more than good ones, especially recent bad events, explaining an observation by Franklin Pierce Adams that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. Also, there is an incentive structure in the prophecy market. Pessimism sounds serious. It sounds moral. Pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimism sounds frivolous. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. So let me conclude then with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I suspect have occurred to many of you. One might think, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to safeguard against complacency, to speak truth to power? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we have to be aware of suffering and danger and injustice wherever they occur, but we also have to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because there are dangers of thoughtless pessimism. One of them is fatalism. If all of the efforts to make the world a better place have failed and things just keep getting worse and worse, why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? As Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. The other danger of indiscriminate pessimism is radicalism. If you think that all of our institutions are failing and beyond all hope of reform, a natural response is smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, in the hope that anything that rises out of the ashes is bound to be better than what we have now. Or, an expression that sends chills through the spine of every American, only I can fix it. Is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that must be solved in their turn. Also, against a backdrop of steady progress, there can be nasty surprises, and I've mentioned several in this talk: the world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, the American opioid epidemic, and the world faces severe challenges that we have not yet solved, including climate change and the threat of nuclear war. I argue that we should treat these as unsolved but solvable problems, not as apocalypses in waiting, and aggressively pursue solutions, such as in the case of climate change, decarbonizing the world economy with a combination of policies such as carbon pricing and technologies such as low, zero, and in the future negative carbon technologies. Sweden is at the forefront of this movement thanks to its reliance on nuclear power, among other things. And we should pursue denuclearization of the international arena via enhancements to strategic stability to safeguard against accidents and miscommunication, and a program of arms limitation and reduction, culminating in the total abolition of nuclear weapons in the future. Final question, and one that is quite acute to me as someone who has argued that there is such a thing as human nature. Does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Is humanism just too arid or tepid or flattened to get people's hearts pumping? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies have shown themselves to be the happiest and healthiest places on Earth. And as we are all too aware, they are the top destination for people who vote with their feet. And I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, perhaps even spiritual. It's not just a myth. Myths are fictions, but this hero story is true. True to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity, to any sentient creature with the power of reason and the urge to persist in its being. For it depends only on the convictions that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, peace is better than war, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you.
Thank you so much.